Morning, and thank you for coming to the press conference. My name is Ron Latz. I'm a state senator from St. Louis Park, and I'm chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I'm very proud of our state's criminal justice system, and Minnesotans should feel that same sense of pride. Overall, it's a system which delivers justice with great fairness and with integrity. But like all judicial systems, it's not perfect. I want to introduce two men who slipped through the cracks. The cracks of an otherwise well-working system. Behind me today are Michael Hansen and Kwa Fong Lee. These two men served time in Minnesota for crimes they did not commit. And when they were proven innocent, they were released from prison with no assistance to get back on their feet. No official apology for the wrong that was committed or that happened to them. With no money for housing, transportation, health services, or insurance, and a criminal record that is rarely cleared despite innocence, the punishment for a wrongful conviction lasts far beyond the time that someone's released from prison and innocence is proven. Additionally, there are often psychological consequences that stem from being deprived of family and friends and the ability to build a career and rebuild their private lives. Minnesota doesn't help those who've been wrongfully convicted, served time, and later found innocent to get reintegrated into society. In contrast, the federal criminal system does. They have a compensation statute, and 29 other states and the District of Columbia do so as well. That puts Minnesota in the minority of states that do not help the wrongfully imprisoned. Representative Lesch and I are here to announce that we intend to pass a state law this session that will compensate people who were exonerated for the crimes that they have been wrongfully convicted of and imprisoned for. The creation of a compensation statute is not a partisan issue, and it's not an ideological issue. We look forward to receiving bipartisan support for this effort. It's our intention to pass this during the 2014 session because it is ripe for enactment. And I will say, personally, I've seen issues when I co-chaired the Claims Committee as well that led me to believe and to do some research even at that time a number of years ago that we had a need for this statute in Minnesota. And I'm glad that we're coming forward now to make a particular push for a compensation statute. I would now like to introduce my friend and my colleague, the bill's House author, Representative John Lesch.
Thank you for those comments, Senator Latz. Besides serving as a state legislator, I'm also a prosecutor in the city of St. Paul. I've been a prosecutor for 13 years, and I've seen much in the way of serving in that capacity of that side of the justice system. I have special appreciation for the work of the individuals throughout the system on both the prosecution side, the defense side, the defendants, the victims, and the lengths that we go to ensure fairness and correct outcomes. I think it's extraordinary. But sometimes, in rare occasions, something goes wrong. It's my job as a prosecutor to try to catch that. It's the job of everyone in the system to try to catch that. And sometimes it doesn't happen. But this bill is not meant to point fingers or lay blame on those who didn't catch it. This bill will simply create another safeguard into our legal system. Anyone familiar with Michael's and Kua's cases understands the justice of providing some means for them to be compensated for the time that they've served in prison unjustly. Before spending 6 years in prison, Michael had a promising career that was crushed after spending the time in prison for a crime that he did not commit. Aside from support from their families and friends, Michael and Kua had no assistance in getting reintegrated into society. The state of Minnesota actually does more to help people who are guilty of crimes and are subsequently released in order to reintegrate them and establish them as working members of society. In the cases of Michael and Kua, though, we failed in that capacity, but more importantly, because they were unjustly accused and convicted. When guilty people are released from prison, they have parole officers who help them find housing and jobs, and there's mental health and chemical abuse counseling available. Because of cases like Michael's and Kua's, Senator Latz and I are committed to passing a fair compensation mechanism in Minnesota this year. If states like Texas and Mississippi are able to do it, these are states whose judicial systems aren't known for being overly fastidious in looking at cases. If they can do it, clearly Minnesota can do it as well. Before I introduce John Hopeman, who is chair of the Innocence Project for Minnesota, I'd like to note that it's an often quoted phrase in American jurisprudence that it is better that 10 guilty go free than that we convict one innocent person. That extraordinary ratio is testament to the fact that justice is our top priority in the United States of America and in Minnesota. This measure is a basic recognition of the injustice served upon Michael and Kua. So thank you, and I'd like to introduce John Hopeman.
Thank you, Representative Lesch. We would like to thank Senator Latz and Representative Lesch for their support for this important legislation, which we have been interested in getting passed for a number of years. We at the Innocence Project work hard to exonerate people who have been committed of crimes that they did not commit and who end up serving time in prison that they should not serve. As a former federal prosecutor, I have understood the importance of the federal compensation statute, which is important to the very concept of due process and fairness. If someone serves time for something they didn't do, that's just about the worst thing that could happen to a person in our society. And as Senator Latz indicated, the majority of states have statutes like this, as well as the District of Columbia. So Minnesota is a little bit behind the curve here, and that's another reason why we very much appreciate the support of these two legislators. It's time that Minnesota passed a fair compensation statute for men like Kuo Fang Lee and Michael Hansen. To be clear, this law, if passed, will only apply to a person who has served time in prison who has been declared innocent. And we at the Innocence Project know firsthand that it takes an enormous time and effort and money and resources and perseverance to obtain an exoneration. It's a rare thing. In Minnesota, there have been only 2 exonerations in the last 5 years, both of them before you today. Now, I'd like to introduce to you Julie Jonas. We're very proud of her. She's our managing attorney, and she has worked for the last several years in drafting different versions of this statute. She's put a lot of thought and effort into it, and we thank her for being here as well. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I, too, want to thank Representative Lesch and Senator Latz for their leadership on this very, very important piece of legislation. I'm here today to talk just a little bit about the specifics of the bill. In particular, as John mentioned, this is for compensation only for those who are wrongfully convicted and serve time in prison. It would not apply to inmates who are released from prison on a so-called legal technicality, but rather there would be presentation at the district court level of proof of innocence in order to secure their release from prison. As John mentioned, the bar for that is very, very high. And so the requirements for receiving compensation will also be equally high. The exonerees will not receive compensation automatically upon release from prison. However, there will be a provision for services to assist them as they're released from prison. As Representative Lesch mentioned, normally when someone's released from prison, a guilty person's released from prison, they have a parole officer who will help them find housing, help them find a job, help them with mental health issues. When Kua and Mike were released from prison, they had no such assistance. Luckily, they had such strong, supportive families in the area who were able to assist them, otherwise they might be homeless. In addition, this bill would provide for a mechanism where exonerees could go through the administrative law process, and if they meet the requirements of the statute, they could receive a certain amount of compensation. The administrative law judge would base that compensation on the number of years they spent in prison, as well as proven economic loss that they might have had as a result of the time that they spent in prison, and a certain amount of money for education and retraining. The amount of money would be capped. There would be a maximum amount of money available to these exonerees. This isn't about trying to get someone rich. It's really just about making them whole and trying to put them back into the same position where they would have been had they not spent those years in prison. You know, there's been a lot in the press lately about the long-term unemployed and they're unable to find jobs and the effect it has on their cumulative earning potential over the length of their careers. And I always think about the exonerees when I'm hearing about their situation, the long-term unemployed. The exonerees, through no fault of their own, spent significant time in prison, and that's something that they've been trying to recover from. But for Kua and Mike and their families, the effect has been devastating. I agree Minnesota has a great justice system, one of the best in the nation, but on these very, very rare occasions when we make mistakes, we should have a mechanism in place to compensate the victims, like Mike and Kua, of those mistakes. I'm really happy to be here working on this today, to be part of the team that's going to try and get this legislation passed. And with that, I'd invite Senator Latz back.
So we are fortunate to have one of the fairest justice systems in the country, and I would say in the world, but mistakes still can happen. In the last 5 years, only 2 people have been exonerated in Minnesota as a result of the legal proceedings that reviewed their convictions. In extremely rare cases, this can happen, and it will happen in the future. We are a system of human beings, and human beings do make mistakes. And while we can't predict the circumstances in which it will happen, we do have the ability to respond after the fact, and that's what this bill is about. We do intend to pass this bill to ensure that the state of Minnesota is prepared to help these people when the truth finally does come out. Now, we're open for questions. I do want to note that both Michael and Kua are uncomfortable answering questions from the podium in front of everyone, so they've indicated they're willing to stick around and talk informally with any of you who have questions. But if you have a question for them specifically, we ask that you wait until after we formally adjourn the podium time. All right, so,
Senator,
any questions?
Julie mentioned that there was a cap on the maximum amount somebody could receive. What is that dollar amount that somebody could get? What is that maximum dollar amount?
$700,000.
Okay, and again,
Did you want to ask?
700,000, and that's a calculation that goes into the number of years, number of times served, their proven economic loss. Can you just explain how is that calculation made?
Yeah, so that'll be done through the administrative law judge. Like the federal statute and many of the other recent state statutes that have been passed, we start with a base amount of $50,000 per year of incarceration. Then the administrative law judge can also look at other economic damages that the exoneree might have suffered. For instance, if you had an exoneree who was a very high earner at the time that they were incarcerated, right? There might be some economic damages there, both for himself and his family, the loss of his family. Maybe the cost of the attorney to defend the initial trial could be recovered. Again, this would all be at the discretion of the administrative law judge.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you for
We've
coming.
answered everything, huh? Okay, thank you for coming. Appreciate your time today.